I was not very good in math, so I ended up by doing ancient Greek. Has there been collaboration in the past between India and Greece? Very basically. It's an unfair assessment to India, but I think it's, ironically, it's an unfair assessment to the British. It is true that what is interesting in the case of Greece and India is that authenticity or a sort of genuine self-perception is linked with an ancient past. The reason why the English have any contact with India is because of Charles II's wife. So the Sanskrit texts are talking about the same problems that the Greek texts at the same time are.
All this packed knowledge of studying from Kalidas to Guptas and to everybody, when you reached India, what was your what is your thought about the country?
This is India, a story in the making. And I'm your host, Lavinia Tandon. Hello and welcome to India, a story in the making. Today, we're going to talk about something very interesting, which is debated quite a lot, which is India as a concept is pre-British or not? Did India as a concept exist before the British came to India? Also, we'll explore what's in the name, India, Bharat, all this conversation that happens, but with someone who is a historian, but more interestingly for me, someone who was born to an American father and a Northern Irish mom in Venice, and then studied in Oxford, and then studied in Columbia, and then stayed all over the place and went back to teach in Venice. I have to read this, which is Scuola Grande di San Marco, Venice, and also associated with Hellenic Institute of Venice, Frederick Lauritzen. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely.
Welcome.
Yeah.
What's in a name? There is a lot in a name. I really like to try at least to pronounce the names correctly.
Yes.
So tell me again about your institute, how to say it well.
Yes, it's called the Scuola Grande di San Marco.
Scuola Grande di San Marco.
Yes.
Brilliant.
And it was originally a charitable institution in the 13th century, and then it progressed, and now it's become a foundation which also deals with research and cultural events, and we have moments of teaching as well. So that's what I collaborate with them, and also with the Hellenic Institute, which is the only research center of Greece abroad. So that's
But what is very interesting is that Frederick, you'll allow me to call you Frederick, right?
Yes,
because I
absolutely.
can't call Lauritzen the whole time. I think I've done okay this time, I hope.
Yeah.
Is that his expertise is in Byzantine
Yes.
period, and he did a paper for which he went all the way to India, JNU, where I come from, Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi. And we will talk about that paper. But before that, I want to talk about your journey, Frederick. Yes. Tell me about this whole global mix that is happening in you. Let's understand you first before I go into the concept.
Yes. Well, the single most important thing for me is that I was born in Venice. So that's really where I feel at home, and that's really where I grew up. So I grew up in Italy, but in a city with no cars. We have canals instead of streets.
Yes.
So it's a different atmosphere, and the past is very important there. So maybe that's also what shaped my interests, as well as my parents. My father's a historian as well. And but
American.
So yes, American, and I grew up in Venice, and then went to university in Oxford at New College, where I read great. So I studied ancient Greek and Latin languages, and also philosophy and history. And from there I went to New York, to Columbia University, where I spent 6 years for my PhD. A wonderful time. And then slowly went back to Venice, through Paris and through another city in Italy called Bologna. And now I'm back in Venice.
Oh,
Yeah.
so having traveled in so many places, you're a real mix of, what made you study Greek and Latin? What was it not enough that you were already such a mix?
Well, that's actually one of the great privileges of growing up in Italy.
Right.
In Italy, the Italian language derives from Latin. So when you study Italian, it's important to learn Latin to improve your knowledge of Italian, very basically. But the Romans are always talking about the Greeks. So when you start reading in Latin, they're always telling you what the Greeks are doing. So in Italy, it's very normal to study Greek and Latin. They're not specialist subjects. They're subjects that many Italians have studied for 5 years at high school. Latin is almost obligatory for everyone. So that's an ancient language. And then Greek is for the people who tend to be more literary rather than scientific. We have two main choices, which is what they call the liceo classico, where you study Greek and Latin, or the liceo scientifico, where you do Latin plus more math and more sciences. I was not very good in math, so I ended up by doing ancient Greek. But luckily, that's the subject that I fell in love with, and I just continued studying it and enjoying it. I still like reading ancient Greek literature for pleasure. It's not just research and work.
So Italy kept you, though you had an American father and you had a Northern Irish mother. Oxford couldn't hold you back. Columbia couldn't keep you.
Well, no, it's not that Italy kept me. I'd like feeling a link with all these places. But as I have a small child who's 9 years old, it's easier for him to go out in a street where there are no cars. He can play free. And that's the way I grew up. So,
how interesting.
So for me, that's very nice. So it means that in this phase of my life and our life as a family, we are in Venice, and that suits us very nicely. I enjoyed my time in Oxford and at Columbia. Obviously, Oxford is an incredible university and a wonderful town. New York is a very special city that I felt privileged to have lived in. And then living in Paris as well was very nice for 4 years. And then Bologna gave me a different insight into Italian life with tremendous opportunities and discoveries of the way Italy works, which sometimes is surprising seen from abroad.
Really?
Yeah.
Tell me more. How does it work differently?
Well, Italy is a wonderfully friendly place. So when you're in the work environment, you're often sharing very good moments with your colleagues. Sometimes the work is difficult, but you can always get around it with a joke or light comment. It's a very pleasant way of working, even if you're doing something difficult. What is remarkable with Italians is that some of them are truly workaholics. So you very often run the risk of entering the world of non-stop work, which is something that we don't think about when we look at Italy from abroad. So you have the light comments, and then people are working 7 days a week.
Wow.
Until the late hours, and they don't. That category of Italians doesn't go on holiday. They just don't.
God.
They don't think of it. For them, their life is their work, and so sometimes working in that environment is rather challenging. I'm not entirely Italian. In fact, I'm half American, half Northern Irish. So that can be challenging. That real entire.
What's your son? What's your son like? I mean,
he's trilingual. He speaks 3 languages, so he's got a superpower. Means he can communicate with most people he meets who are not, not Italian.
How does he feel as what do you feel like? I mean, what do you feel like? I mean, you said that you are.
Well, I'm British, but my city is Venice, so that doesn't bother me in any way. It's not a problem. It's just an unusual mix. It's just, it means that if people say, "Are you Italian?" I say, "Well, actually, no, I'm not. My family comes from somewhere else. Do I feel at home in Italy? Yes. But Venice is my city. Like if someone comes from Rome, they're not Venetian. I am.
I am. I get that.
It's really that simple.
I found it very interesting when you said that you chose a city where there were no cars.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I grew up with that.
I found it quite challenging when I went to Venice to say, well, but do people open the door and how do they set foot on water? How does it work really every day living just
well,
through
in the old days, which is a couple of centuries ago, the front door was facing the canal because that's where you would.
So instead of cars, you will have canoes.
Boats, exactly.
Boats.
Well, no, you'd have gondolas.
Gondolas. Everyone will have a gondola.
But no, that's in the old days, and that's when people owned an entire palace and rather wealthy. What people do now is that they use the entrance which gives onto the street.
Oh.
So at the back of so we walk around everywhere.
People own cars?
No.
Well,
they do, but they don't use it that much because the car is somewhere else.
Is the environment better because of that?
Yes, the air is better. I mean, you notice it if you come from Paris, for example. You notice it even staying just a few days outside of Venice. The air is really not as good. And you're on the sea, so you have the breeze from the sea. It's a very natural environment in some
last
ways.
question on Venice, then I think we'll move on. But we've heard that Venice, the city is going to, what's the word I'm looking for? Venice
sink?
as a city will sink, yes.
Well, I mean, they've been saying it for a long time. I think my great-great-grandmother wrote home when she came to Venice, and she said, "You must come quick, Venice is going to sink." Well, hasn't happened yet. So we're just living here and now, and at the moment it's there.
Okay.
So,
I also took my children to Venice and say, come on, this city might sink.
Yes, exactly.
Let's go and have a look. The most amazing and different city.
But there's a human aspect which is remarkable about Venice because cars are very isolating. When you enter a car, you're in your own world. When you go out of your front door in Venice, you have a problem because you'll automatically bump into the people you like and the people you don't like.
How
all the time.
Interesting.
So you're immediately seeing people, and then you say, I forgot to ask him something, let's have coffee together.
And
the Italians very often go to a bar and they'll stand up and have an espresso. You don't sit down. It's not like in France.
Okay.
So you stand up, have your coffee 5 minutes, exchange one or two ideas, and then move on.
It's time for us to move on too, but this is very, very interesting for me. It was a great digression, I think. Now, moving on, your interest in India, and when I say India, did India as a concept exist before the British or not?
Yes, well, in the short answer is that the word India, referring to everything south of the Himalayas, is present in Greek texts from 2,500 years ago. So the historian Herodotus, who's also known as the father of history and the father of lies as a result, he actually refers to India specifically. And his information was filtering from Persia, because at that time the Persian Empire was very large, and on one side it bordered with India, and on the other side it bordered with Greece. So that's why the Greeks use the word India. It's a Greek word, India.
Oh, India is a Greek word.
So clearly it existed before the British left India, or even before they arrived there. It's an ancient word. Ironically, that's why the British used it, because it was the only correct term for the place. But it was a Greek word derived from Sanskrit, referring to the Indus River, which in Sanskrit is Sindhu, so with an S. And the S was dropped and replaced with an H by the Persians, by the Iranians. The Greeks couldn't pronounce the H, so they dropped it and it became India. And that's the term that was used. And so India without an S or an H is the Greek form, specifically.
Interesting.
before we go more into this, I wanted to know your interest in the paper that you did.
Yes.
Because your expertise is in Byzantine.
Yes, exactly.
And what made you write a paper, and what paper was that? Please do tell everybody.
There has been an acceleration in collaboration between Greece and India in the last 2 years, and among the aspects which the two countries want to collaborate on was a question of culture. So the first question is, has there been collaboration in the past between India and Greece, very basically? So a conference was organized in JNU, which was the first episode the first episode in this series of conferences, with a Greek delegation and an Indian delegation, and myself and my wife as well. And it was throughout the ages. It talked about the time from, let's say, the Greco-Indian kingdoms and the period of the Gupta Empire, and then later the Mughal Empire. So it covered a large framework. The whole that was missing was the period of Byzantium. And the reason why I proposed the paper and why it's interesting is that the Greeks did have contacts with India when India became predominantly Hindu. And that was specifically in the Byzantine era. So the Byzantine Empire is defined by when the Roman Empire decided to move its capital from Rome in Italy to Constantinople, which is now Istanbul in Turkey. When they moved there, moving east, they had an interest in the links with the East, including India, and they established diplomatic embassies. That's very probably how chess reached the West, because obviously chess is an Indian game, the chaturanga, and the Byzantines used a Greek word derived from Sanskrit. So the game was coming from India, not from Iran. So there are elements of direct connection. But what's extraordinary is that it's a connection not specifically with the Buddhist world, as it had been before, but specifically with a new, precisely Gupta Empire, with different interests, and specifically with Vishnu and etc., with other focus, let's say.
So when someone says to you that India as a concept did not, or geographical concept did not exist before the British arrived and they unified India, what would be your historical response with historical reference?
Well, I think that's really, I think it's, to be honest, it's an unfair assessment. It's an unfair assessment to India, but I think it's, ironically, it's an unfair assessment to the British, because the geographic concept of India was known from the earliest times. The fact that India went through different political phases is a different point. India was always India in the Greek texts, and it was there. It was not somewhere else. Italy has a parallel history. Italy has always existed as a place that one refers to, Italy, but it was unified in 1860. So it became a country with a single legal system, let's say, later on. But it was referred to as Italy in the 14th century, long before, and everyone knew that was Italy. So it's not always a problem, let's say.
Give me references in the Byzantine text that would prove what you're saying, and give us stories. That is most interesting, actually.
Yes, well, the thing is that we have a wonderful, we have a
timeline. What timeline are we talking?
Well,
Sorry.
the period, the paper I gave, I talked from the 4th century to the 11th century.
Right.
So that's the time when the Roman Empire dropped paganism and became Christian.
Right.
So it's the creation of Christianity. With the Emperor Constantine. But there are two anecdotes, I would say. There was an emperor in the 10th century who clearly understood that his son was not very good at following the court ceremonial. Too many court ceremonies were going on, so he wrote a book describing them all. So we have the Book of the Ceremonies. One of these ceremonies describes how to greet the embassies from India and how to write to them. When you write a polite letter, you would say, you know, the two emperors, Constantine and Romanos, which gives a date around 920 AD. So that's interesting. So it's before the Sultanate of Delhi, but after the Gupta Empire. So it's an interesting phase. And there were direct links, Constantinople, India. Say they would write and say to the ruler of India, our dear friend, and then they would continue their official letter. But he had the official term, the designation was our beloved friend. So there were good relations, and part of the reason was the difficulty that the Byzantines had and the people in India had of keeping the trade routes open when there were Persians and people in the Arabian Peninsula in the middle. That's the reason why the Byzantines and the Indians were in touch.
What was the difficulty?
Precisely the fact that the Persians and the people in the Arabian Peninsula would not allow trade to happen. They would block the ships, or they would take the goods and sell them on themselves. And so the Byzantines and the Indians were trying to keep trade routes open. One of the famous trade routes was the one that used the monsoons that allowed direct navigation, and rather quick navigation, from southern India all the way to, let's say, Somalia, approximately, and then Ethiopia, and then up. So
how would they find? How did they find a way out of not being looted in that peninsula? What was the alternative?
Well, it became more and more difficult, but there is evidence of commerce, because in the Delhi Museum there is a coin from 1045, which for some reason people haven't really studied. But if you have a coin from 1045, that's a coin that didn't exist in 1042. I know it's obvious, but it means that it was created after a certain date and then it reached India. So there was commerce, there was trade. One of the most extraordinary aspects is that we see that's actually the only time we have a real influence of Greek on Sanskrit. There are Greek words that enter Sanskrit, and it's astronomical terms. There's a great Indian astronomer from the 6th century who starts using Greek names of planets and Greek names for measurements of the planets. And he writes this in a book called the Romaka Siddhanta, so the Byzantine wisdom. And there's another book called the Paulisa Siddhanta, which means the wisdom of Paul. Paul came from the Byzantine Empire. So it's clear there was a connection, and they knew it. It's just us. We're not very good. We forgot things that are interesting.
We are good at forgetting.
Well, that's the problem with history.
And we remember the wrong things, we forget the right things.
and that's a funny thing, because it's a contact and friendship between two nations that are distant, but are intellectually curious of one another. The life of Buddha was translated into Greek. We had stories that were also translated into Greek. From Sanskrit. So there were contacts. I always imagine people at an embassy, what happens once you've said what you need to say that's so important? Well, you go out and you have dinner with your newly acquired friends and you start telling stories. You say, this is the story that's come out most recently. This is the game we play, like chess. This is what we play. And I think that's also a form of communication.
Very interesting. You said shatranj.
Yeah.
Is the game came from India, but in what period? I mean, we often associate shatranj with the Islamic period.
Yes, but it's a Sanskrit word. It means the four corners. So in Sanskrit, it doesn't. So it's
that
not
thing they paid in Mahabharata, didn't they?
Yes, exactly. So there are images there are miniatures showing chess in a Hindu context specifically. So the Greek word doesn't seem to come from shatranj. It seems to come more from an earlier form of the same word.
Which is?
Chaturanga.
Chaturanga.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. Very interesting.
Because chatra is 4, no?
Yes.
Exactly.
Chaturanga.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
So.
Oh, that's what.
Whereas shatranj is the Persian form.
Huh.
But in Persian it doesn't mean anything. In Sanskrit it does.
Ah, yes.
So that's also, that's very typical of the Greek world too. Words have meaning. So every culture is ancient, every culture has a distant past, but not every culture writes it down. The Indians and the Greeks have this aspect in common of writing and referring to what interests them. Over the centuries we have ancient texts from India, we have ancient texts from Greece. Not every culture does that. So there's an interest in language, in communication, sometimes saying, you know, we know better, so we're going to write it down. But that's an interesting way of dealing with one's own culture.
Very interesting to hear that India as a concept had the way and the manner in which it existed. But today when you say Bharat,
Yes.
and it versus India, when you hear this whole thing about India edging to change their name to Bharat, how
Yes.
does it speak to you? Because you have studied this.
Well, the thing is that there are countries that are referred to from there's a way of referring to oneself, and then there's a way other people refer to you. In Greece, for example, most European languages refer to Greece with a word that sounds like Greece, Grecia in Italian, Gurza in Serbian, or words like that. In Greece, it's called Hellas or Ellada. That's how the Greeks refer to themselves. So that's why we talk about Hellenistic or Hellenic, because that's how the Greeks refer to themselves. Armenia is another case. We tend to talk about Armenia, but they refer to themselves as Hayastan or Hai. So they're words which are very different. So if India prefers to refer to itself as Bharata with a very ancient denomination, which appears in the Mahabharata and in various ancient texts in classical Sanskrit, that's India's choice and it's right. Turkey recently has changed by law its name to Turkey, so one's no longer allowed to refer to Turkey as Turkey. Even in English, one should say Turkey. So I think it's the right of every country to refer to themselves as they want. There is a slight colonial aspect, if that's what the debate is about, because India is what in Greek you'd call an exonym. It's the name you give as seen from abroad. It's what the Greeks referred to when they reached India. When they would communicate with Indians, they would say, "You are India." But it's their word.
And so it is. So this whole thing, I think, we feel, and it is happening a lot in the world, where they just want to authenticate their identity, if you like, isn't it? And stamp as their own. Do you see a kind of an identity crisis or some? Why is there so much changing of names, wanting to change that name and authenticating their identity?
Yes, I think that it's there's an aspect where people they're troubled to see other countries speaking about them in a different way, or the perception of not being treated as an equal is a strange perception, because whenever you're dealing with another country, whichever country you are, they're bound not to understand you because they're a different country. It's just that simple. But sometimes it feels offensive, and that is completely understandable. But that's something which, In Europe, one sees that a lot. You know, the French with the Belgians, they're like, oh, you don't understand me, or the Germans with the French, or the Italians within Italy itself. Each region is always making jokes and fun of other regions. It is true that what is interesting in the case of Greece and India is that authenticity, or a sort of genuine self-perception, is linked with an ancient past. So if you find the ancient way of referring to yourself, we must stick with that. Because I think what's interesting is, and that's why I'm interested in India and Greece, is the idea that the future is colored by the past. So that is a very interesting idea. We don't want to repeat the same mistakes. Yes, there's an element of we were there before, we know how it's going to go, but it's having a precedent is very important. You don't want to, in one's own life, one chooses to do things based on the mistakes one's done in the past.
Yes, I was about to actually ask you what interested you in studying the Greek and India connection, or Greece and India connection, really. And
yes, well, this extraordinary connection, I didn't realize that there was direct contact between the two cultures. The thing which is very striking, I studied a lot of ancient Greek, and the closest language to ancient Greek is actually Sanskrit. So there are just extraordinary amount of parallels between the two languages. And so that is something astonishing in itself. And by the way, it's something which some of the British who went to India cheated a bit, because when they reached India, they could study Sanskrit because they'd studied a lot of ancient Greek before. So it was not entirely impossible. They weren't struggling with a very difficult language. Their task was made a bit easier. That's why one started having English people who would know Sanskrit, because the leap was not that big. So that contact is extraordinary. And also the fact that both cultures think that the most important aspects of civilization come from them. So
yes, that's the whole idea of we were the most ancient.
Yes, exactly.
Actually, in the world which is really growing, a world that is really becoming global and one, scrounging for your own identity and saying, you know what, we were the ancient civilization, which is where all this rhetoric and narrative is coming from, maybe.
yes, but I think that what is really quite extraordinary, and maybe a source of something that one should think about, is the fact that there are now the countries are really divided into two groups. You have the countries like Greece and India who think the past is extremely relevant for their own identity and for the future, and the contact with other cultures. And then there are countries that think that we must eliminate everything to do with the past, because that is an obstacle to the future.
Example.
So, well, in many countries in Europe, the study of history and geography has become optional.
Really?
Yes.
Which
And
countries?
in France and in Germany, and that creates a problem, because when you hear people, for example, in the Indian foreign ministry, like the foreign minister of India, they will talk about the geographic position of India and the fact that that defines India's policy, or they will talk about the past of India as defining the policy. But India is confronting countries that are saying geography and history don't count. So that means that you have people at the same table who are speaking two different languages. And that's difficult, because it's not a question about being different, it's a question they're speaking two different languages. So
Yeah,
they
they're coming from the same-
can't bridge the differences because they're not speaking together.
But why no interest in history and geography?
Because they think of it as a problem which is something that blocks the moving forward.
Ashamed?
No, not ashamed. They just think it's irrelevant.
How is it? Why?
I know it's very difficult for us to. It's difficult for us to understand, but that's why it's very usual to meet people who don't know. Well, sometimes also in this country, in the UK, history is problematic. I could give a very concrete example, given the question of India. Few people are interested or are aware that the reason why the English have any contact with India is because of Charles II's wife was Portuguese and therefore had Bombay. Mumbai was a Portuguese colony. That's the only reason why the English have any contact and link with India is because of the Portuguese wife of Charles II. But that means that England depended on the Portuguese trade routes, which were much older and rather important for India, even for Sri Lanka and even for Calcutta, for different cities, not just Mumbai or Bombay. So that's something which is very important today, now, but it's not being considered. A Portuguese colony that's important in this aspect is South Africa. So and that has an Indian connection too. So that's why history is important.
But when you studied India for your paper and your research, what is it that you learned about it that was new, fresh, or amazing, or something that you, problematic for that matter?
Well, what I was really astonished by was obviously I had to do a crash course in reading some classical Indian literature which was not Vedic, so something more recent, so Kalidasa and poets like that. And what surprised me very much was the Indian theatre from the classical Sanskrit period. Yeah, exactly. So so these were genres that I was interested in, so a type of literature. I like literature very much rather than history. And the other thing which I was curious about was Kalidasa talks about the Raghu dynasty and the question of the conquests in the northwest and the invasions from there, and the fact that he talks about peoples that came from the northwest, called the Huna, that the Byzantines had problems with all the way in the west, in Europe. So the Sanskrit texts are talking about the same problems that the Greek texts at the same time are, but at a huge distance. So these vast migrations of people north of the Himalayas and how they reach Europe, Hungary, Turkey, and how they affect India all the way to Delhi. But the Greeks and the Indians are writing about the same people.
And who are these people?
So they're technically called well, they used to be called the Hephthalite Huns. Then it goes on, but there are.
What is it today?
Today it's the people who speak languages like Turkish or Uzbek or Kazakh or Turkmen. So it's really a very wide area, but also Hungarian. In English we talk about Attila the Hun as a symbol of someone who was really quite a strong leader. Well, Attila the Hun is the same as Huna, the people who were in the area of Afghanistan and let's say Pakistan, and who were trying to enter in the area around Delhi, effectively. And that Kalidasa writes about.
My God, so the problem of all these Turkeys and all these people where Pakistan is today and everywhere, the problem of them entering Delhi.
Well,
what is today Delhi?
The foreign minister of India pointed it out. One has to just step back and say geography is geography. The Himalayas are very difficult to cross, which is why it's the land of snow, isn't it? Himalaya. And so what's very important in that chain of mountains is that there's a dip, the famous Northwest Passage, which,
and we still have the same
which
problem.
is the only real route of access, and that's how it is. It's interesting that there are Sanskrit texts that talk about this.
Wow. So
It doesn't-
what problem we had at the time when Kalidas wrote, we pretty much have the same kind of. Am I right to say
well,
that?
it's not a problem. It's the fact that's where I think it's important to make a distinction. We're not saying there is the same problem. We're saying there are the same dynamics. There's only one way to go north of India, and it's that way. Or there's only one way of entering India, and it's that way. That's how it is. And it's always been like that, and you're not going to move the mountains. So obviously the great poets, the great writers write about that. The Greeks do the same. They describe geographic situations or movements of people. Alexander the Great's conquest of Persia is very interesting because he showed that once you get going, you can just move along until you reach the Indus River, and then it's more complicated.
Okay, my last bit. You, with all this packed knowledge of studying from Kalidas to Guptas and to everybody, when you reached India, what was your what is your thought about the country?
Oh, I loved it. To be honest, it was my dream since a long time to go to India, and it was. I was expecting to have a wonderful time, and it was better than what I expected.
Yeah.
Because
Did you like the chaos, the smell, the sound?
Yes, but also I liked the fact that people were the people I met were very polite. So it was easy to interact, and it was relaxed, calm, and there was this, you could tell that there's this background, which is always there. You know, a long past is something that sometimes is a relaxing element, because you feel more sure of yourself if you have a longer past.
I want to end up by saying, tell me in few lines your response to people who want to debate the fact that India was unified the way it was by the Britishers.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's the case. I mean, the way the English and the British and then the UK entered India and then established a presence there was not really systematic. It's a very complicated story, and also from a British point of view, it's very complicated how it went. So they didn't enter to create a concept. They just happened to be there.
Thank you so very much. And
Yeah.
on that note, there is a rapid high five section in which I will ask you some rapid questions. Don't look so sad.
No, I'm delighted.
There is a reward. I'll give you a high five.
Oh, fantastic.
What is India for you in one word?
Calm. Calm.
Really? People find it chaotic. You found calm there.
Yes.
Why? What was it?
Precisely that. I've been to other countries which seems chaotic, and they were created anxiety. Having a different way of organizing things does not mean chaos.
How wonderful. How wonderful. I wish more people see this.
Well, yeah.
What is the one thing about India that Western people do not get?
That it's a universe. I mean, the fact that you have so many